Welcome to the channel. My name is Dylan, and today we have a Wittnauer from the 1940s. I really love something about this brand. The kind of spade or deco hands especially really get me, and I love that they have the all steel cases, which is relatively rare in the cheap watches from this era. Most are plated, and often you have plating issues. Let's take a look at this, see if it winds. Hand set, that's a good sign, but not when the crown is pulled off, so something's going wrong there. When you try to, well, and there comes the crown. So something's certainly wrong with the retention screw. Typically, if you can set the hands in the wind position, that means that the screw is either missing or not properly screwed in. First thing first, let's get this bracelet off of here. This is the expanded kind of metal bracelets. These were pretty popular in call it the 70s, but obviously not so popular today. One thing you can always look at is the spring bars, and while not a critical part, it gives you a good sense because this is a piece that's typically replaced or at a minimum cleaned when you service a watch. It gives you a good sense of how much wear a watch has gotten. And turning the watch over, let's see if the case back will come off, and it does. This is just a grippy rubber ball in order to get that off. Taking a look inside, yeah, there's that beautiful Wittnauer movement on with the stainless steel case back. Nice little perlage on. First things first, I'm going to tighten up the crown retention screw just so I can set the hands together, which makes them easier to take off. Pop that in the hand set position. Looks like it's working. And then get those hands together so that they're easier to take off. And just check if it's winding here. It seems to be, but it's very sticky, so fully wound but not running. And a little bit of air on the balance shows that the balance doesn't want to spin either, so not a great sign, but we'll see if it's hopefully just hasn't been serviced in a while and has some gummy oil, or if there's something larger going on with the balance itself. And removing the crown and stem. Can then flip the watch over, give it a little tap just to get it out of its case. Crystal doesn't look too bad except for that one large scratch. Case looks okay otherwise. This is a radium dial, something to keep in mind. So you can kind of see the shadow where the hand hasn't moved in years and kind of left a shadow on the dial. That's also another good indication besides the color and the time period that this is a radioactive dial. So wearing a mask here and just being careful. This is a membrane box to make sure that those hands don't get damaged. One of the things that drew me to this watch is just the pretty intact and beautiful loom that these hands have. This is, I think, has been reloomed at one point in the past, otherwise it would match the numbers more closely, I think, but regardless, either it was done intentionally or just was done a long time ago, but the kind of creamy loom on those hands is very beautiful. That box will just hold it safe. Next, there's a movement ring. So just use a gentle prying motion to get that off. These metal rings are quite a bit stickier typically than a modern plastic ring would be. Gently pry that off. And there it goes. Wittnauer was a brand started in the United States, was really popular with explorers. They made military timepieces. They made all sorts of kind of navigation equipment as well. Just overlap with the fine machining capability. Amelia Earhart had Wittnauer instruments in a couple of her planes. So just a really cool company. They were an independent brand for a long time. This movement, and I think all of their movements, weren't made in-house necessarily. So this, I believe, is an ETA 1080 movement. But a really cool brand with really great styling. They were originally bought. They were bought by Longinus eventually, and I believe they still kind of exist as a sub brand. Although the quality of the watches in that brand has really gone down. Just like the hands, this is a special box just to protect that dial and make sure nothing happens to it. And on to the movement itself. So first here, we'll take off the minute wheel with the gold washer and remove the canyon pinion gently while we're on this side of the movement. Has to remove the cannon pinion because the wheel that it's attached to on the other side can't be removed otherwise. And then we'll take the balance off right away. Just make sure has the most delicate part, that get it out of the way of any accidental slips of the screwdriver. We'll do any troubleshooting as to why it's not spinning once we get there. And gently remove that. By normal standards, all the parts on a watch are pretty delicate, but the hairspring is by far the most delicate. I'm putting the crown back in. This is just so I can take the tension out of the watch so that nothing breaks when I remove the pallet fork. Just let the crown run through your fingers and slowly unwind. And it might not be obvious here in the video, but this unwind is incredibly sticky. It's clearly gummed up somewhere in the movement because I'm barely touching the crown and it's unwinding incredibly slowly. Yeah, you can see I'm actually helping it turn. So something's going on there, either in the mainspring or somewhere in the train of wheels to really make that gummed up and difficult. To find out what, take the ratchet wheel off, first of all. So what allows you to wind the watch. Also keeps the mainspring from unwinding. Oh, change my mind. Take off the pallet fork. Probably a good call. The pallet fork is, another one of the quite delicate parts on the watch. Something that really just take off first to make sure you don't damage it. And the little bridge has a little cutoff to slip your screwdriver in and pry it gently up. Yep, and that's a good indication this watch hasn't been serviced in a while. If pieces are sticking together, that means the oil typically has dried up and gone gummy, and it only does that if it has been in the watch for many, many years. Now I'll take the ratchet wheel off. You can see I'm being very careful with these screws. A lot of these screws I would call perhaps a little tighter than I would have left them. There we go. And yeah, it might be hard to see on the video, but there's a layer of old dried up oil all over that. It's probably why it was hard to unwind or sticky to unwind. Taking off the trainer wheel bridge. And skillfully removing the two screws. Just like the balance bridge and the pallet bridge, there's a little carve out in the corners just to allow you to gently pry this bridge up. And remove that. And the fourth wheel. Escape wheel. take the crown wheel off. So the third wheel is just slightly underneath it. There's no reason to try to get it out of there, bend anything. That's reverse threaded. The crown wheel is often reverse threaded, or almost always reverse threaded. Nice little detail in that. Has a little bit of a bearing on there as well. The third wheel out. And then the center wheel has its own mini bridge underneath. Technically, if a bridge does not span and it is not anchored at both sides, it'd be called a cock. So you have pallet cock, the balance cock, and I think this would count, even though it has two screws. I think technically it would be a center wheel cock as well. And removing click spring. Click in the click spring, I should say. I like this click spring design because the spring is not really under tension when you're taking it apart. A lot of features on these ETA, old ETA movements are very kind of watchmaker friendly. They were designed to be taken apart again and again, and so they, for the most part, except for where they can't avoid it, they make it really kind of friendly to take apart. And take the balance bridge off. That center wheel bridge is just a bit sticky, so I want to get other things out of the way while I can before I mess with it. Really want to take it straight up and out, which can be hard to do with this bridge in the way. Yep. And you can see the barrel is stuck to the bridge again, quite firmly really. And that's again just an indication of some dried on crud oil. Put that aside for later. And now, gently, now that I can get to it from both sides, there we go, gently pry up the center wheel bridge. And again, you can see the center wheel sticking to that. And gently remove. That's just about everything from this side. While we're here, we can pull out, can unscrew the setting lever screw. And while we're here, we can take out the sliding clutch and the winding pinion. And they'll both kind of fall out if you turn it over anyways. And you can see the setting lever fell off there as well because we'd taken the setting lever screw off. Some will be retained depending on the setup of the movement, but here it kind of floats by itself. And on the dial side of the movement, a little cover plate. That retains the minute wheel. On an ETA 1080 like this, these are probably the smallest screws in the movement. Maybe this is an older style with screw-down jewels, so those are equally small, but those little pieces of those little screws are just like pieces of dust. And a little intermediate wheel. Those actually have a top and a bottom, which can be kind of hard to tell. Just something to keep note of. If you're ever trying to wind a watch and it's skipping and not setting correctly, that's probably that piece is up and upside down. And this is kind of a combo cover plate and spring. Call that maybe the setting bridge. It's maybe the correct term for that. here there's a loaded spring, so I'll hold that down with a piece of pegwood just to gently take that out. And then we can take the clutch lever out gently, lift it straight up. So that's pretty much every piece off of the watch, except for the jewels, the cap jewels that this older style has. You can see there's 3 on this side. But I'll put these away, get it cleaned up. First though, let's take the mainspring out of the barrel, push on it, the wrong way first always, and then gently from the top, pop the lid off. Tweezers are just to make sure that the lid comes off without the spring exploding out. Move the barrel arbor. Another method to remove the barrel arbor. And the barrel arbor goes into my lap. But safe and sound and hasn't been cleaned yet. Gently remove the mainspring. As far as I'm aware, there's no special tool for this. It's basically pry it up and get your fingernails under it, and then gently walk it out. This works really well until about the last turn or so, and then you have to be very careful not to have the barrel go flying. Just like that. I like to demonstrate what not to do whenever possible. This looks like a newer mainspring than the period of the watch, so this watch has been serviced at some point. You can see with the recurve and the kind of the silveriness of it, it's a new style mainspring. And here I'm putting all the pieces into the cleaning baskets. I don't have a good setup for cleaning or a good setup to film cleaning, so once all the pieces are in the baskets, I'll cut back to the cleaned pieces here in just a second. All right, so everything's clean. And now I'm going to go through these jewels, take the 3 caps off, clean each one with pegwood and a little bit of solvent, oil the jewels, and then put them back on. So just undoing the screws. Again, just a little bit tighter than I would expect for something like that. Look how tiny that screw is, just a tiny piece of dust. A trick for little pieces like this, you can't get them out with your tweezers, and maybe something I should have done with the clutch lever, is you can get a little piece of Rodico and kind of stick them out, stick the Rodico to them and pull them out that way. Here I get stubborn and I stick with the tweezers before giving up. There you go. Little touch, pulls it right out. So I've cleaned these jewels with pegwood and solvent, dipped them in solvent, cleaned out the holes as well, and now I'm applying oil and replacing the jewel. And the idea is you want it to go straight down exactly where it needs to be so that the oil stays exactly where it needs to be. I am by no means an expert, so this is what I would consider very good for me, where my skill set is at. Not perfect, but every time you miss, you should take it out, clean all the oil off, clean the hole again, try again. So I spared you a couple of attempts here. So this is the watch flipped over, and the center wheel is going back on. So a little bit of oil on that jewel, and the center wheel bridge as well. I've cleaned and oiled that removable jewel there as well, or cleaned at least. I think I oil it next. And replacing the screws. A lot of these little screws will have a section at the tip of the screw that doesn't have threads, and that allows the screw to kind of seat correctly in the hole before, while you're lining it up, so that it always engages, or not always, but typically it would engage correctly. If they don't have that, some of the smaller screws maybe don't have room for it, it can be really helpful to screw it in reverse for half a turn until you kind of hear it seat and feel it seat, and then you can engage the screw in the other direction. It's a good tip to avoid. Always make sure to drop your pieces. A really good tip to avoid cross-threading screws, because these threads are tiny, and just the tiniest bit of effort. This is not a big bolt. This is a tiny screw, and the tiniest bit of effort, you can cross-thread them immediately. So putting the barrel in place next, just a tiny bit of oil where the barrel arbor meets the barrel. And the second wheel goes in, and the third wheel, first, center, second hands, the third wheel threads through the center wheel. A little bit of oil. I use three types of oil, kind of light, medium, and heavy, if you will. So anything with a jewel is typically a lighter oil, because the jewel's, kind of a metal on jewel surface. The medium oil is one step up for that, and then the heavy oil is for places where it's kind of heavy metal on metal contact. More in the keyless work than anything else. Yep. Just get the third wheel out of the way. Lots of fiddling in order to get the escape wheel in there correctly. I would say this is one of the trickier parts of this 1080 movement, is getting this bridge on correctly, because that escape wheel is just doesn't want to stay upright, right? It wants to turn over slightly. So getting the bridge lined up can be very difficult. And then here's the trainer wheel bridge. And gently get the bridge set in place. And then each of the ends of the wheels, the pivots, need to perfectly align. So I sped this up a little bit, but you can see fiddling mostly with the escape wheel in order to get that where it needs to be. Now that I have it, I'll hold it in place with the pegwood and get the screws where they need to be. Yep. And I've kind of got myself crossed up here. So I'll put the first screw in. That way I don't need to hold the pegwood necessarily. You'll notice I don't screw that screw all the way in. I actually leave it a little bit loose, just so that I can test the gears and make sure everything's perfect before tightening down and potentially bending something. Quick test. Make sure it's all spinning freely. A final tighten on the screws. Next, I'll oil the jewels on this side for the train of wheels. Here's the setting lever screw. So this gets some of that heavier oil, the medium viscosity. And then this needs to go into the main plate before the barrel bridge goes on. Definitely forgotten that before, and there's nothing to do except for take it back off. Here's the barrel bridge. Mainly just needs to line up with the barrel arbor, the barrel pivot if you will. Make sure that's spinning freely again. And screwed down. You get a bit of a sense, especially on a movement you've worked on before, or a type of movement you worked on before, about the screws. So for instance, on this Wittnauer, the barrel bridge screws, the train of wheel bridge screws, and the balance bridge screws are all the same, and they're kind of distinctive. They're the largest, so it's pretty easy to pick out actually which screws go where. And just a little bit of oil where the barrel pivots. There's metal on metal. It turns so slowly that it's not typically, a super high wear spot, but it does wear out for sure. Relatively thin metal around that hole. And here's the click spring. Again, I like this design because it isn't under tension while you're trying to put it in there. And make sure that's doing what's expected. Next up is the ratchet wheel. And the barrel arbor is square, so the ratchet wheel grips on the barrel arbor, and that's what winds the mainspring. You've got to make sure that the square hole is lined up correctly. Tightening the ratchet wheel winds the mainspring, and because there's no pallet fork, it just spins the train of wheels. But really, you can still get it tight enough. And a little bit of grease on the crown wheel. The parts of the watch that the user interacts with are actually really some of the highest wear and kind of highest grease parts. I typically use the thicker grease on that spot where it has that little bearing, and then the crown wheel goes in with its reverse threaded screw. If you see 3 lines on the head of a screw, that means it's certainly reverse threaded. Otherwise, ratchet wheels typically are reverse threaded, and I've even seen reverse threaded barrel screws as well. That's pretty rare. Flipping the watch over, start on the keyless works. Here's the clutch wheel. Again, a little bit of that thicker blue grease where this interacts with the sliding clutch. Slip that into place. This is a center seconds watch, which is, I think, technically a complication, but really just a little bit of blue grease on the sliding clutch as well, and then where the setting lever, where the clutch lever hits it. But really, this movement is about as simple as you can get as far as number of parts. There's no date, there's no chronograph, there's no hack, there's no additional functionality besides the center seconds, which isn't really much of a complication at all. And a little bit of grease on the stem as well, just where it interacts with the sliding clutch and where it sticks into the main plate. And in with the stem, make sure that's all lined up correctly. Next is the setting lever. And then this needs to be tightened from the other side. There's no great way to do this. Some people put a piece of Rodico on it to hold it. I find it easiest, make sure your finger cots are relatively clean and hold it with a finger and turn it over and hold it. But this is one of those operations in watchmaking that doesn't really have a perfect way to do it. So this is obviously not an ideal way to screw in the screw. And a little bit of grease. Clutch lever. That interfaces into the notch in the sliding clutch. Apologies, I'm bumping my camera here. This is pretty close-up work and it's a little bit in the way. Next, the spring. Again, this little spring is very powerful by watch standards. So this is one that as soon as I have it in place, I'll hold it in place with the pigwood again, but as soon as I have it in place, I really want to get that cover plate on as quickly as possible, because if this spring disappears, the chances that I find it are pretty low. Make sure it's set in place. Exactly where you want it while holding it down. And I like to test knowing which way the top of the clutch lever is. It can sometimes be difficult. A lot of pieces you can tell which side's the top just by the finish, but for whatever reason the clutch lever often that's not as clear. So just holding the spring so it doesn't go anywhere and then making sure that the clutch lever is interacting correctly. The setting lever is a nice double check. Here's that cover plate. And this, if you can see at the bottom there, is what holds onto the setting lever and gives you that kind of click in and out as you pull the crown to the hand set position. There we go, and with that cover plate in place, breathe a sigh of relief because that spring can no longer go anywhere. And then just a little bit of grease. Maybe a little bit too much grease. Take a little bit back off. Where the crown interfaces. I really appreciate you taking the time to watch along here. I'm definitely not a professional at this. This is a hobby that I picked up, one that I found really interesting. It's a very deep hobby. Um, put the Canon pinion on. It's a very deep hobby, one that, even if you know technically what you're supposed to do, executing it well and perfectly, and especially on an old watch, you often need to be perfect. And the minute wheel here is very difficult. So something I find incredibly interesting. I haven't really gotten into, case restoration at all. Um, and some, staking a jewel. I think that there's a lot of things that I haven't even touched yet. But the parts that I have done, I find immensely rewarding. And the little cover plate that holds the minute wheel and that little intermediate wheel down. It's just the two of the tiniest little screws. And I was talking earlier about how, some on good movements, the screws will have a little area of no threads to help them seat in, but these are too small to have that. So they can be very tricky to get to line up correctly, especially given their size. I think one of the hardest things to learn, or maybe more surprisingly hard things to learn, is just tweezer control. I think for the first, 2 weeks that I got into watchmaking, I was continually squeezing things too hard with the tweezers and just having them ping across the room. And really controlling how hard you squeeze things is incredibly important. Here's the pallet fork. Now I think the professional way to oil a pallet fork is to put it in the watch and then oil it through the tiny little hole. But there's just no way that I could pull that off. So another way that I use is to kind of stick it into some Rodico, and then you can oil it in place. And you're just trying to put the tiniest little amount of oil on the face of that jewel. I think ideally, just cover a third of that jewel, which is a minuscule speck. So and line up the pallet fork. This is another piece that can be a little bit tough because it's a somewhat top heavy. And its little bridge. So the way I was taught is that you don't oil the pallet fork jewels because it moves, it's so light and it moves so much, and it's so in perfect balance with the escape wheel that the oil would actually be too much for it. I'd be interested if others have different opinions on that, but that's the way I was taught. And the pallet fork is in. So I'll wind the watch. Get some power into it. And then you can test the pallet. It's hard to tell, but you can see how I'm not pushing it all the way. I'm getting it started, and then it's flicking itself back and forth. That's how you know it's correctly engaging. So one of the most difficult parts about an old watch like this is the balance and the servicing of the balance. Newer watches will have more sophisticated jewels, typically some kind of spring on top, so you can release the spring, take the jewel out, clean the jewel, put it back, and you never have to really disassemble the balance. But this watch is not shock protected, which means to access the jewel in order to clean and oil it, you have to completely remove the balance and the balance spring from the balance bridge every time you want to service it. And that's just a huge downside of these older watches. Also, not being shock protected. A little bit self-explanatory, but if you were to drop this watch, the balance, again, a relatively heavy part on a small jewel, which is hard but brittle, would likely break the jewel. So here's the balance itself removed. And so I'm just taking a look at the spring, making sure that the spring looks good, which it looks perfect. You don't want the spring to be, convex or concave. That means maybe someone was pulling on it or something like that. And the spiral should be basically uniform all the way through. So now that the balance and the spring are out of the way, I'm removing the jewel itself. Tiny, tiny little screws. I'm just taking a quick inspection of that. So that has a jewel with a hole through it, and then this is the jewel with the flat bottom that sits on top. So I'll take these jewels away and all these balance pieces and clean them in a solvent and make sure that they're perfect. If there's any jewel on the entire watch that matters the most, this is probably it. So here they are all cleaned. And now I'll reassemble the various pieces. Much like the little cap jewels on the other side of the movement that I showed you, the idea is that you put a precise drop of oil on this jewel. Should be roughly half the area, half the radius of the jewel itself. It's a little drop of oil. That's what I'm doing here, and I have, you can't see it, but I'm wearing a loupe to magnify this. Just try to get a perfect drop of oil, and then you want to set the other piece directly straight down on top of it so that that oil remains exactly where it needs to be. You can see I gave it a little push sideways there, which is not ideal. I think I did this about 3 times and I only filmed it once, so I'm not entirely sure this is the what ended up on the watch, but this is the procedure. I think I tried to film it once and then I couldn't see well enough and I couldn't get my face in there with the camera in the way, so I redid it off camera. Get the tiny little screws back in. Just even picking them up in the right orientation, it can be very difficult. And again, this is where if you squeeze too hard on that screw, it is round, and it will shoot across the room, and that screw is the size of a piece of dust. You'll never see it again. Right, the jewel's back in place. Now the balance can go back on. So the balance spring has a little stud on the end. It's pushed into the hole, and then a screw from the side holds it in place. And again, just another tiny screw into the most delicate component of the watch. And it can't be mounted very nicely. It has to be stuck down by Rodico. Just a very fiddly little delicate operation. And then something even more fiddly, to adjust the timing of the watch. You basically move the hairspring back, you clamp onto the hairspring and move that back and forth. So where it clamps on, which I think I didn't show just because I couldn't film it while doing it, has to be clamped around the hairspring as well. But we're all back together. And lay the balance where it needs to go. Make sure the pivots are in place. And there it goes. Most relieving sight. Take an entire watch apart that isn't working, put it back together, and it fires up right away. So with it running nicely, the balance bridge screw on. Tighten that down. Here it is in the time grapher, and I've just sped up working on it. Because you have to take everything apart, it never starts off very close. Just the slightest touch moves it back and forth, but here I go, got it into within 3 seconds a day with 1.6 milliseconds of beat error, which for a watch from the kind of 1940s I think is about as good as I could possibly expect, or as good as I'm willing to spend the time on anyway. Adjusting the beat error on these watches is even more difficult, so just not something that I'm prepared to do if it's that close. We have a crystal lift and inserting a new nice crystal. If you're ever going to get into watchmaking, replacing a crystal is the easiest thing you can do to make a watch look nicer, hands down. But if you're going to get a crystal lift, get a nice one, because I spent a lot of time messing crystals up with a cheap one before I realized what the problem was. And we have the hour wheel and that foil washer on. That's just so that the hour wheel does not rub on the underside of the dial. Loosening up the dial feet screws. And here's that beautiful dial. I just love this dial with that, aged loom. That dark spot is where the hand stopped, and the loom of the hand kind of burnt into the dial a little bit. Be very careful not to touch anything but the edge of the dial. Certainly not touch that loom. That loom is a powdery paint applied on top of the printed dial, which means if you touch it with your fingers, you can basically just knock it right off. Tightening the dial feet. These screws go into the side of posts coming down from the dial feet, to hold it in place. And we're really on the home stretch now. So here we have the hands in their box. And again, you could reloom hands, but they look as nice and as kind of period aged as these. I'm not going to do anything to these at all. Just keep them nicely in the box and gently put them back on the watch. First, the hour hand. It doesn't really matter what direction the hour hand's pointing, because you can always change it before you put the minute hand on. Just making sure it's centered. Lined up. Of all the things, I always find the hands kind of the scariest, right? Because this is what you see of the watch, and they're incredibly delicate, incredibly fiddly to make sure that they're lined up perfectly. You can do this with a hand tool as well, but I find my success rate with this tool that kind of makes sure that the perfectly vertical pressure is a lot higher. So here I am checking to make sure that it's not going to rub on the dial. It's just above it. Seating it just a little bit more. Yeah, I've adjusted it to 12, so If you think about it, the watch doesn't know where the hands are, right? The hands are put on afterwards. So as long as the hands are in a valid position, so both pointing at the 12 in this instance is probably the easiest way to do it. Your hands will be accurate from then on, is the idea. And same procedure, just to describe this as kind of a gentle but firm press. And then the second hand, gently set it in the right place. You can tell it's in the right place because it'll start moving even before being pressed on. But this is getting stuck on a post that is, size of a needle maybe, so getting it perfectly lined up can be very difficult. And then this is just a very gentle press. Here I am again checking to make sure all three hands are going to pass each other without hitting. That's the most important thing. You don't want them to hit the dial and you don't want them to hit each other. And then this is probably my least favorite part of watchmaking, which is cleaning out the case. So I didn't show all of it, but I kind of, with the Rodico and the air blower, spent probably another 15 minutes getting it perfect, getting all the dust out. And insert the crown, stem and crown. Get the setting lever screw tightened down. I really want to appreciate everyone that made it to the end of the video. I realize it's a long one. I I do this really as a hobby. I am an amateur, and I think I was watching another watchmaking video a couple weeks ago, and I think he said, the easiest way to figure out a better way to do something is to post the wrong way to do it on the internet. So to the extent you have ideas on what I can do better, please let me know. Appreciate the consideration for this being a hobby and not a profession. And I hope that you enjoyed. This is a hobby that I got into when I basically stumbled across it on YouTube and then took a course, and it's something that I really enjoy. So if you ever want to get started, definitely recommend it. And it can be a little daunting, but if you get a watch that mostly works already, it's and you're careful, it's hard to make it not work. So here's a close-up of that beautiful dial. It's what we kind of attracted me to the watch in the first place. I love the shape of those hands, that old loom, kind of that blued finish. Just a very beautiful watch. So this is one that I'll probably wear regularly.